The roar of heavy machinery drowned out the quiet morning as a massive bulldozer rumbled down Cedar Grove Lane. I sat in my favorite armchair, barely awake, when a deafening sound jolted me from sleep. Outside, through the frost-covered windows, I saw an unbelievable sight. My neighbor's house, one I'd admired for its charming character, was being torn apart by a fleet of construction vehicles. Thick clouds of dust and debris filled the air, and the cacophony of metal grinding against brick shattered the peaceful dawn. I couldn't believe my eyes. Just last night, I'd heard frantic phone calls from other residents reporting an emergency demolition on the block. The headlines later would scream of an HOA mistake, an order so misdirected that it had led to the complete demolition of the wrong house. And as the chaos unfolded, an unsettling realization began to form. This wasn't just any house. Hidden behind the rubble, unbeknownst to the overzealous officials, the owner of that demolished home was a federal agent. The shock wasn't merely for the destruction wrought on what appeared to be a modest, time-worn family home. It was the sudden, ironic twist that the house belonged to someone who'd spent years protecting the nation. In the midst of the roaring machinery and swirling dust, I felt an icy shiver run down my spine. The thought that the HOA could so carelessly obliterate property without even verifying ownership details made my blood boil. This was no ordinary case of mistaken demolition. It was a catastrophic breach of protocol that would soon unravel secrets at the highest levels of law enforcement. And deep down, as I watched the debris settle like a grim snowfall across Cedar Grove Lane, I knew that this was only the beginning. The federal agent, whose covert work had been hidden behind the unassuming facade of a suburban home, was about to reclaim his territory in a way that would shock everyone involved. Today, as the dust settled and the true story began to emerge, one thing was certain. The repercussions of this monumental error would ripple far beyond the confines of our quiet neighborhood. The clash between bureaucratic overreach and the resilience of those sworn to protect our freedoms had only just begun. Cedar Grove Estates was a picture of suburban perfection, a meticulously planned community where every home was identical, every lawn trimmed to perfection, and every detail was governed by the strict, unyielding rules of the Homeowners Association, HOA. In this carefully curated environment, conformity was not only expected, it was mandatory. Every resident knew that even the slightest deviation from the prescribed aesthetic could result in fines, warnings, and public shaming. At the center of this regime was Karen Patterson, universally known as HOA Karen. In her late 40s and always dressed in crisp business attire, Karen took it upon herself to enforce every rule with an almost fanatic zeal. With her clipboard, smartphone, and a steely glare, she roamed the streets of Cedar Grove as if she were the sheriff of a lawless frontier. Neighbors whispered her name with a mix of admiration and dread. Her uncompromising approach to preserving community standards had earned her both respect and revulsion. On the outskirts of Cedar Grove Estates, nestled among mature oaks and rolling fields, stood a modest, time-worn house that many assumed was just another victim of the HOA's stringent regulations. Unbeknownst to most, however, that house was the secret residence of Agent James Jim Reynolds, a federal agent working undercover to protect national security. By day, he maintained the unassuming facade of a retired military veteran enjoying the quiet life of suburban living. By night, he operated deep, sensitive investigations that spanned the nation. His true identity was guarded fiercely, known only to a trusted few. For years, Agent Reynolds had kept his covert life hidden behind the facade of an ordinary homeowner. His residence, though modest, was fortified with subtle security measures and a network of discreet surveillance devices, reminders of a life spent in the shadows. He valued his privacy and the sanctuary that Cedar Grove offered, even as he continued his high-stakes work under the radar. The setting of Cedar Grove Estates, with its immaculate driveways, pristine sidewalks, and uniform facades, made an ideal place for someone like Karen Patterson to wield her power. Every day, Karen would meticulously inspect lawns and public spaces, issuing citations and fines for any perceived imperfection. Her passion for conformity was unyielding, yet it was this same passion that would eventually lead to an unprecedented catastrophe. On the fateful morning when the bulldozers roared to life and began demolishing the wrong house, the serene order of Cedar Grove was shattered. The community was thrown into disarray as residents watched in horror and disbelief. Questions flew thick and fast. How could the HOA make such a colossal error? Who was the unfortunate victim of this overreach? And most shockingly, why had no one verified the ownership of the property before ordering its demolition? Within this unfolding drama, Agent Reynolds remained calm behind his unassuming exterior. He had no inkling that his secret identity would soon be thrust into the spotlight, a revelation that would not only upend Karen Patterson's rigid system, but also spark a fierce confrontation between bureaucratic incompetence and federal authority. Cedar Grove Estates was now more than just a picture-perfect suburb. It had become a battleground where the right to private property, the duty of public service, and the hidden depths of national security would collide. And as the chaos of demolition echoed through the neighborhood, the stage was set for a showdown that would change everything. The demolition began at dawn, when the roar of heavy machinery filled the air and confused onlookers gathered on street corners. Karen Patterson, ever the vigilant enforcer, had been the driving force behind the erroneous demolition order. Fueled by her uncompromising belief that every property must adhere to the community's strict aesthetic and zoning rules, she had submitted a series of reports to the HOA that claimed the demolished house was in severe violation of the community guidelines. Her reports were thorough, detailed, and backed by a bureaucratic machinery that rarely questioned her authority. However, what no one had bothered to verify was the true ownership of the house. In a series of miscommunications and administrative oversights, the demolition order was greenlit without a proper title search. The bulldozers rumbled forward, and within hours, the structure that had sheltered Agent Reynolds for years was reduced to a pile of rubble and twisted rebar. The devastation was swift and absolute. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as what they thought was just another old house vanished into dust. The initial shock soon gave way to a flurry of frantic calls. Some residents demanded explanations, while others expressed outrage at the HOA's blatant error. Karen, initially triumphant, found herself in the eye of a rapidly growing storm of dissent. Her previously unassailable reputation began to crumble as questions emerged. Who had approved the demolition? Why was the owner's information missing? And most importantly, what would happen next when the truth came to light? I had long suspected that the HOA's processes were far from infallible, but this incident was a stark confirmation of their fallibility. With my heart pounding, I immediately began to dig for answers. I contacted local authorities, filed a formal complaint with the HOA, and reached out to my network of neighbors to gather every scrap of information available. It wasn't long before whispers of a federal agent's name began to circulate, a name that sent shockwaves through the community. The house that had been demolished wasn't just any property. It belonged to Agent Jim Reynolds, a man whose work in national security was known only to a privileged few. As the details started to emerge, the community's reaction became a mix of outrage and disbelief. Online forums exploded with heated debates as residents discussed the magnitude of the mistake. They demolished a federal agent's house? One post read, while another exclaimed, "Karen's so-called standards have gone off the rails." The digital evidence, security footage of the demolition, copies of Karen's reports, and even snippets of internal HOA communications was circulated widely, turning the incident into a rallying point for those who believed that unchecked power had gone too far. Meanwhile, Karen Patterson found herself caught in a tightening spiral of accountability. Her initial confidence began to wane as board members and community leaders demanded answers. At a hastily organized emergency HOA meeting, several members expressed their shock and dismay at the oversight. "We relied on the data presented to us," one board member lamented, "and now we face the catastrophic consequences of our inaction." The meeting was filled with a mix of blame, confusion, and an urgent need to remedy the situation before it escalated any further. I watched all of this unfold with a heavy heart, but also a growing sense of resolve. The demolition of Agent Reynolds' house wasn't just a bureaucratic error. It was a stark symbol of how the machinery of the HOA could wreak havoc when left unchecked. I knew that the next steps would be crucial. The truth about the house's ownership had to be revealed, and accountability had to be enforced. I mobilized my network, urging neighbors to document their own experiences with the HOA's overreach. Social media exploded with stories of arbitrary fines and misguided orders. The hashtag Demolished by Karen quickly trended, and soon the digital dossier against the HOA was growing by the minute. Every piece of evidence, every eyewitness account, was a building block in the case against Karen Patterson and her unchecked authority. In the midst of this chaos, whispers about Agent Reynolds grew louder. It turned out that Reynolds had been leading a double life, quietly serving as a federal agent while living as a humble resident in Cedar Grove. His true identity had been a closely guarded secret, and now, with his home demolished, it was only a matter of time before the full weight of federal law came crashing down on those responsible. The stage was set for a monumental confrontation between the rigid, unchecked power of an overzealous HOA and the unyielding authority of federal law. In the wake of the demolition, Cedar Grove was thrust into a maelstrom of outrage and disbelief. Social media platforms lit up with live streams, video clips, and a flood of comments as residents processed the enormity of what had transpired. Hashtags like hashtag Demolished by Karen, hashtag Federal Agent Home, and hashtag HO Exposed trended locally and even caught the attention of regional news outlets. People who had long suffered under the strictures of the HOA suddenly found their voices, and what began as a local administrative blunder soon transformed into a full-scale public relations nightmare for the board. Local news reporters arrived on the scene, their cameras capturing the charred remains of the demolished house. "This is unprecedented," one reporter stated on air. "When an HOA makes a mistake of this magnitude, the repercussions could be far-reaching." Interviews with shocked residents and outraged neighbors added to the growing chorus of demands for accountability. Many could not fathom how such a catastrophic error could occur in a community that prided itself on meticulous order. The narrative quickly shifted from a simple case of mistaken demolition to a broader indictment of bureaucratic overreach and incompetence. Inside the HOA board, tension reached a boiling point. Emergency meetings were convened behind closed doors, and leaked minutes revealed a bitter divide among board members. Some defended Karen Patterson's actions as necessary for upholding community standards, while others acknowledged that the oversight had been a grave error that endangered not only property rights, but the trust of the entire community. "We have a responsibility to our residents," one board member was quoted as saying, "and if we fail in that duty, the consequences will be severe." The internal conflict was palpable, and as more digital evidence surfaced, it became clear that the board's credibility was hanging by a thread. I continued to update my digital dossier, posting every new piece of evidence on community forums and social media. Video clips of the demolition, screenshots of Karen's frantic messages, and even snippets of internal emails from the HOA board formed a compelling narrative of mismanagement and abuse of power. Neighbors rallied behind the movement, sharing their own grievances and calling for an overhaul of the HOA's policies. The digital petition demanding accountability for the demolition amassed thousands of signatures, and influential local bloggers began to spotlight the incident as a turning point for Cedar Grove. Meanwhile, Karen Patterson found herself increasingly isolated. In a series of desperate attempts to defend her actions, she released a few hastily recorded videos in which she claimed that the demolition was a necessary corrective measure to improve community standards. But each of her statements was met with ridicule and countered by the overwhelming evidence of her error. The more she tried to justify her actions, the more her credibility crumbled in the court of public opinion. The situation escalated further when whispers of Agent Reynolds' true identity began to circulate. What was initially a quiet murmur in the background grew into a resounding revelation. The demolished house belonged to a federal agent. The news spread like wildfire, and soon, local law enforcement and federal authorities were drawn into the controversy. The gravity of the mistake was no longer confined to a neighborhood dispute. It had now become a matter of federal interest. Local authorities issued a formal statement, clarifying that the demolition order had been issued without proper verification of property ownership and that an investigation would be launched immediately. The statement was a public admission that something had gone horribly wrong, and it lent significant weight to the community's demands for accountability. As the days passed, the pressure on the HOA board became almost unbearable. Neighbors organized protests, and community meetings filled with impassioned speeches echoed the call for reform. Every shared video clip, every hashtag, every comment from a resident reinforced one undeniable truth. If the board did not act, then the consequences of their arbitrary overreach would continue to harm innocent homeowners. The final public hearing was scheduled, a moment that promised to be the turning point in this entire debacle. In the days leading up to the hearing, I personally attended several community forums, urging residents to bring their stories and their evidence to the table. The digital dossier had grown into a formidable compilation of facts and testimonies, and it was clear that the community's demand for justice was not going to be silenced. On the morning of the hearing, Cedar Grove was abuzz with anticipation. Neighbors gathered at the community center, holding signs and banners that read, "Respect our rights," and "No more arbitrary fines." Every conversation, every shared post, echoed a single message. Our community would not be bullied by bureaucratic incompetence any longer. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, a final, decisive moment when the HOA board would have to confront the harsh reality of their actions. The decisive moment arrived on a crisp, clear morning in a packed boardroom at the Cedar Grove Community Center. The room was filled with HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and hundreds of determined residents, all gathered to witness the final public vote that would decide the future of our community's enforcement policies. With a calm, yet unwavering presence, Councilwoman Rebecca Matthews stepped up to the podium, her eyes gleaming with the collective resolve of a community that had long been silenced by arbitrary power. After a comprehensive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed internal communications, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an incontrovertible conclusion. Councilwoman Matthews began, her voice steady and authoritative. It is abundantly clear that the demolition of the property in question was the result of a grave administrative error, an error driven not by legitimate safety concerns, but by personal bias and the unchecked power of an overzealous enforcer. Our community's right to private property and individual expression has been violated, and we will not stand for it. A heavy silence fell over the room as Matthews continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all fines and sanctions related to this incident, and we will initiate a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such an error to occur. Moreover, new guidelines will be implemented to ensure that all future decisions are based on verified facts and respect for property rights. Today's decision is not merely about correcting a mistake. It is a resounding declaration that Cedar Grove will protect its residents' freedoms and hold those in power accountable. Her words resonated deeply, and murmurs of approval spread throughout the assembly. At that moment, a respected community advocate, known for his unyielding defense of individual rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united," he declared, his voice firm and impassioned. "No resident should ever have their property or livelihood threatened by arbitrary decisions. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that Cedar Grove values truth, accountability, and the inalienable right to live without interference. We demand justice, and we will not rest until every violation is met with swift, decisive action." His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting the room in a powerful call for reform. Following his address, a senior representative from the local regulatory agency presented the final dossier, A meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, expert testimonies, and internal reports that confirmed the demolition order was issued without proper verification of ownership. The evidence was irrefutable. The house that was demolished belonged to a federal agent, and the mistake was nothing short of a catastrophic oversight. The Internal Affairs Panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release to ensure complete transparency. Councilwoman Matthews concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Grove, a community where every resident's rights are respected and where public authority is exercised with fairness and integrity." Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no one, no matter how self-important, can impose their will on our community without accountability. Together, we stand for justice, transparency, and the right to live freely on our own property. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for property rights and individual freedom. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Grove. The days of arbitrary rule enforcement were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the historic vote, Cedar Grove underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded fines and sweeping reforms implemented by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and social networks, igniting impassioned debates about property rights, community governance, and the sanctity of individual freedom. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Grove" and "Community United for Justice," celebrated the decisive action taken to protect every resident's right to live, work, and express themselves without fear of arbitrary interference. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreHOA, and #CommunityJustice trended widely, reinforcing our collective resolve to stand up against abuses of power. Town hall meetings and community forums saw unprecedented attendance as residents gathered to share their experiences and to envision a future where personal creativity and individuality were not stifled by rigid conformity. Neighbors who had long endured the oppressive grip of arbitrary enforcement now spoke openly about their right to manage their own property and pursue innovative ventures. "Our homes and our land are our legacies," one impassioned speaker declared at a bustling meeting, his words echoing throughout the crowded hall. The atmosphere was charged with hope, a promise that Cedar Grove would forever honor the spirit of independence and creative expression. Within the reformed HOA board and local regulatory agencies, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary processes were established to ensure that every complaint was thoroughly scrutinized and that no resident would ever again be subjected to arbitrary fines or undue interference. Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of our community, Lieutenant Reed affirmed in a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our renewed commitment to fairness and accountability. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized to empower residents further. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about property rights and the importance of standing up against bureaucratic overreach. When we come together, our voices have the power to reshape our community, a local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring neighbors to unite in the pursuit of justice. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to fight back against HOA Karen's egregious actions, by reclaiming my property through creative innovation and by standing up for my rights, had not only restored my sense of autonomy, but had also sparked a movement that resonated throughout Cedar Grove. Neighbors who had long been silenced by fear of retribution found their voices, sharing their own stories of resistance and inspiring a new era of collective empowerment. The digital evidence that exposed the sheer absurdity of the demolition and the subsequent arbitrary fines became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and the right to express oneself freely. Karen Miller, once the feared enforcer of the HOA's draconian policies, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when a community unites for justice. Her influence dwindled as records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the urgent need for reform and the dangers of unchecked authority. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Grove, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered beneath the warm glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights," was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate our victory over arbitrary interference, a victory for every homeowner and every creative soul in our community, Councilwoman Matthews proclaimed, her voice resolute and inspiring. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protect our freedoms and to ensure that Cedar Grove remains a place where creativity and individuality are cherished. As each new day dawned over Cedar Grove, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how the HOA demolished the wrong house and exposed the hidden truth of a federal agent's identity, how the digital evidence united our community, and how a bold stand for property rights reshaped our future became a rallying cry for every resident. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Cedar Grove, truth, justice, and individual freedom would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Grove would forever be a place where freedom, integrity, and respect for individual expression shone brighter than ever.